Good afternoon. Please stand clear of the closing doors. We are ready to depart. Welcome to a return to Metroland, Julian Barnes in conversation. My name is Sean Keegan and I'm delighted to be your host today, and I do think we're in for a real treat. Julian will be joining us shortly, and very soon I'll be talking to my first guest. But first, a little bit about the event. We are streaming live from Amersham Museum, and I do have to be careful how I say this. We are in a medieval hall house on the high street. And we're surrounded by displays of the town's history, you'll be glad to know. The area's traditional crafts, and of course the impact of the old Metropolitan line. Our studio audience here will be able to browse the museum afterwards, but if you're watching at home, please do make the time to come and see the museum when you have a chance. So, today's event, it's the first in a series set around the Chilterns story collection. 10 tales, each reflecting different aspects of the cultural and environmental heritage of the designated landscape here. The Chilterns area of outstanding natural beauty, which of course is where we find ourselves today here in Amersham. So the story collection is a way of connecting people to the area they live in the hope that they will be inspired to take care of it for the benefit of future generations. The event is organised by the highly alliterative Chalk, Cherries and Chairs team at the Chilterns Conservation Board. I'm sure they put that in there on purpose. And a word from our sponsors, it's primarily funded by the Community Environment Fund and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. The event is also part of the Being Human Festival, which is taking place across the UK until the 19th of November. Being Human is the UK's national festival of the humanities, and we'll be hearing more about that soon from my first guest. I should say, however, that Geeta Ludra, who was supposed to be here, is unfortunately ill. She's a member of the Chilterns Conservation Board, so she couldn't make it today. We wish Geeta a very speedy recovery. On her behalf, I would just simply say that the board are the appointed guardians of this area, which sounds a little bit like the guardians of the universe, but maybe that's the same thing, because they're basically protecting the very special character of the Chilterns. Now, Metroland is a key part of that character. Suburban commuter belt, a green space on the edge of London. And Amersham is, as you probably will see from the beautiful Metropolitan line tube map that we've got here, it's the farthest flung London Underground station. It's about 24 miles northwest of Charing Cross. Now, the line was extended here in 1892, but it was in 1915 that the term Metroland was coined by the marketing team at the railway. And they did that for their annual guide, which I think ran until about 1932 or something. The guide extolled the good air of the Chilterns and used language like each lover of Metroland may well have his own favourite wood, beech and coppice, all tremulous green loveliness in spring and russet and gold in October and November. As I was driving here, lots of beautiful russet and gold. So, with this guide from the Metropolitan Railways, effectively Metroland was born, and the character was changed forever. Houses were built for bank managers, aspiring families moved to escape the city, and with that the railwaymen had, almost inadvertently, created suburbia. And it was along that extended Metropolitan line, at the start of Julian Barnes' debut novel, that his protagonist, the young Christopher, found himself living. As a boy, Julian himself was living along the Metropolitan line too. But perhaps that's where the similarities begin and end. We'll no doubt find out soon when Julian joins us and I ask him some searching questions. Talking of questions, if you're watching online, please do have a look. You might have to scroll down a little. There is a box there. You can submit your questions, and we'll have some time at the end to answer as many as we can. But now, I'm delighted to be joined by my first guest, who has quite literally written, or at least co-edited, the book on Julian Barnes. Along with Peter Childs, he's the co-editor of the collection in the Contemporary Critical Perspectives series, published by Bloomsbury. He's a writer, a teacher, and a scholar on contemporary culture. He has published over 10 academic books, but during the day he works as a professor of English literature at the University of Wolverhampton, where he leads a computational literary studies project on inclusivity and diversity. I'm no doubt he'll be telling us about that. It's Novel Perceptions Towards an Inclusive Canon. So please do welcome me now join me in welcoming Professor Sebastian Groes. So, formalities over.
Thank you.
I'm going to call you Baz, as I'm sure you know. So first of all, we were talking about the research that you've done, novel perceptions. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for having me on the show. So at the University of Wolverhampton, as you were kind of suggesting, indeed, we are doing a project called Novel Perceptions.
Okay.
It looks into unconscious biases that we have as readers, as people. What we want to understand is how people perceive literary quality, for instance, and what does an actual good book, how do you make a good book, and how do people perceive that? So we've got this kind of multidisciplinary kind of setup looking at a psychological survey where we kind of interrogate readers about what makes them tick? Why do you buy specific books and not others? How does your cultural background shape your perception of the world? And this is kind of a replication of earlier research in Holland that was done called the riddle of literary quality.
Right.
And we've got some interesting kind of research on Julian Barnes.
Oh, excellent. That's very on point.
Why we're here.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we want to know is how do people shape their opinions of literature and quality? And what we found, I guess, 7-8 years ago in the perception of Dutch readers is that Julian Barnes was the highest scoring person in terms of literary quality. So he is perceived by the Dutch public to be, I don't know, the most literary person that is kind of in that particular kind of research. So we found it very interesting. And what we want to know with this research is why is that so? Because it's a subjective perception. Mm-hmm. What kind of factors are there that give Julian Barnes that kind of level, that scoring, the rating? So, and
can I just ask,
yeah,
when you say literary, in layman's terms, what do you mean by that?
So in the research, we don't define it because we want to know how people define what is literature, what is literary.
Okay.
Because people, professors and academics like me, we've got a long history of thinking about what makes literature literature. Literary critics, publishers, literary agents, they have determined what is literature, but we want to kind of build up a new type of canon from the bottom up, shall we say. So we want to hear from the people what they think is really worthwhile in terms of books, and whether we want to call this literature or not doesn't necessarily matter. So Barnes was the highest scoring author in terms of literary quality in the Dutch research, and since then we have been following up with Novel Perceptions, looking at a big kind of corpus, 400 contemporary novels, and The Noise of Time is in the corpus as well. So another Julian Barnes novel, and lo and behold, the UK public also scores that one very high. It's the second in terms of literary quality. Again, this says a lot about the UK public and its perception of literary quality. So clearly, Barnes has built up a kind of a reputation, a very strong reputation. He's won the Booker Prize, various prizes across the oeuvre, shall we say. So we want to dig into the data a little bit more to understand why people really think he's such a fine, brilliant writer.
Yeah, and with that in mind, with the research in mind, but also with your knowledge of Julian's work and your PhD, I believe, goes back to the kind of start of this. But where would you place Julian Barnes in today's sort of literary body of work, if you like? And also, I'm interested to know where you would place his first novel, of course, which is why we're here in Amersham, Metroland.
Yeah, so I guess what I myself, I've got an opinion. What the data tells us is that Julian Barnes is basically central to the canon. So the canon is kind of the body of works that we think are worth studying, that belong to a particular nation. They embody values, moral values, and kind of the national spirit, as it were. And I guess Barnes's position is pretty much central in the contemporary canon. But there's a little caveat here, I guess. So what's interesting when we compare the Dutch and the English or British research is the top 10 in the earlier Dutch kind of research was dominated by men. In fact, the first 35 novels in that list were basically all men. 8 years later, I think 7, 8 years later, what we see is that the top 10, in terms of how people have responded, how they've engaged, thinking about the general quality of books, is slightly different. So Bernardine Evaristo is one of the key writers, Camilla Shamsi as well.
So much more diverse.
Much more diverse. The top 10 has 9 women in it. And also Stephen Fry, a very popular author. So it's really interesting to see how through contemporary emancipatory debates about inclusion, we seem to be reading differently, but also we're perceiving the world differently. So there's an interesting kind of tipping point, I think, we're hitting at the moment. And we may want to ask Julian about this, maybe, his opinion about what is happening in the literary world.
Well, that's a nice segue, because I do think it's time now to bring our special guest on. But I'm happy to say that Baz, given his expertise and his insights, is going to stay with us. It's often said that Julian Barnes needs no introduction, and then people like me go and give a long list of all his achievements. I was tempted not to, but I think that would do him a disservice, and I do think there are some key things that we should know. We should know that he's been a lexicographer, he's been a literary editor, he's been a TV critic, but of course, as a writer, incredibly prolific, has written numerous novels, short stories. He's also written under different names. His latest book, of course, Elizabeth Finch, came out just this year. He has, as I think Baz mentioned, also received several awards. In 2011, he won the Man Booker Prize for The Sense of an Ending. He's appreciated not only in this country, but also abroad. In 2017, the French president appointed him to the rank of officer in the National Order of the Legion of Honour. And of course, for his debut novel, Metroland, in 1981, he won the Somerset Maugham Award. So, well-travelled, well-respected, well-loved, and back here in Metroland after all these years. Please join me in welcoming Julian Barnes. Julian.
Thank you.
So nice to see you. Thank you. Have a seat.
What have they been saying about?
I know. You'll have to watch the film. It's all been recorded. So, Julian Barnes, thank you so much for agreeing to join us for what I hope is going to be a constructive loaf.
Very nice memo cards.
Oh, yes. I'm glad you appreciate
like
those.
When I go.
You can take them. I need them for the moment. So yes, we're hoping this is going to be a constructive loaf. And for those of you who don't know, that's a concept that Tony, Chris's friend in Metroland, put forward. And his theory was that by lounging about in a suitably insouciant fashion, but by keeping an eye open all the time, you could really catch life on the hip. You could harvest all the aperçus of the flâneur. And for those of you who don't speak French, that I think roughly translates as the kind of the comments of the cool observer of urban society. So we have at least 2 cool observers of urban society with us today. And with that in mind, I'd like to just take a little stroll down memory lane, or if you prefer, down the Metropolitan line.
Yes.
Julian, I know you've said that Metroland is not autobiographical.
Did I? You learn to lie as a
Yes, at some stage you said that, but then
Yes,
maybe you said
yes.
it was as well.
Yes.
But it is, of course, your coming-of-age novel, your Bildungsroman.
Yes.
And so a little bit of biography here, I think, without sort of drifting into this is your life.
Yes.
You were 10 when your family moved to Northwood.
Yes.
And you were educated at the private City of London School for Boys.
Yes.
And so, like the protagonist, Chris, as a schoolboy, you became a suburban commuter.
Yes.
To and from Metroland. So my first question, Julian, is how does it feel to be back in Metroland after all these years?
Well, it's a bit strange. And I don't know, do you count Amersham as Metroland?
Yes, I think we do, simply
Yes.
because the Metropolitan line extends here.
Yes. Well,
although I know you were further down.
yes, I was further down socially as well, I think. I mean, I was amazed how posh Amersham was when I got there. And I was in the green room and I was looking up a hill and there's this grand mansion at the top of it. And
Yes.
There's nothing like that in Northwood. I mean, Northwood was real Metroland because I don't think it really existed until the Metropolitan line came.
Right.
I don't remember, there's some here who are more expert than I am, but I can't remember any really old houses in Northwood. And then there was Northwood Hills, weirdly named because there was not a hill in sight, and then Pinner and so on.
I think they're the new bits, typically, aren't they?
Yes, yes.
So
See, it's posher because as we're coming in an Uber here, we went through Chesham Bois.
Oh.
Pronounced Chesham Boys, you see. You see how Chesham Bois as opposed to Northwood Hills.
yes.
Yes.
Well, it has echoes of the French, of course. And the other question that I wanted to ask you was really a broader question about roots. Partly because I think there's a lot of movement in Metroland, but there's also this sense of, where do we come from? Where are we going? You've got two very sort of different characters in Chris, the very English character, and Tony, the much more sort of Eastern European character.
Yes.
You've then got, of course, the whole midsection, which is about travelling to Paris and that whole awakening, if you like, of sexuality, I suppose, in Paris.
Yes.
But I do know that you're going to read a few sections for us, and early on, Tony and Chris prided themselves on being rootless. Perhaps you'd like to read that section, if you would, from the beginning of J'habite Metroland. I live in Metroland.
Yes, I'd say two things first.
Yes.
But one is that I wrote this book I started writing this book nearly 50 years ago, and I've never reread it.
I was going to ask you that.
I've never reread it from start to finish. I've dipped in occasionally
Really?
when someone's asked me something. So, Baz, I will rely on you to know my novel better than I do. And the other thing is that some of the novel is autobiographical,
Right.
sometimes closely autobiographical.
Right.
Though not as closely autobiographical as you might think. You mentioned the Paris section and the awakening of sexuality.
Yes.
I
didn't want to pry.
No, I don't mind prying. Prying is often met with lying. So I was in Metroland was published. My first book to be published in France was Flaubert's Parrot, unsurprisingly, and then they gradually picked up the other books. Metroland came out about 1995 or something like that, and I went over there and they said, we've got a little television interview with you. I said, oh, that's nice, and it was freezing cold. We went up to the north of Paris, Butte-Chaumont, somewhere like that, and they sat me on a sort of high point in a public park, and they interviewed me, and at the end I said, just out of interest, why are you interviewing me here? And they said, oh, well, because over there, just over there, that's where you lost your virginity. News to me. Anyway, yes.
Lovely.
So, then the second thing I wanted to say is that partly because it's autobiographical in some ways and in other ways not, and it's so the book itself came out 42 years ago. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
When I look back at my past, it's sort of overlaid with what I've written about it.
Right.
And so at times I don't know what's true and what's not.
Memory.
I know, memory has become my big theme as a writer in recent years.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, rightly so. So, as you said, there are two boys, one called Christopher Lloyd, who's the narrator, and the other is called Tony Barbarowski. And I very cunningly disguised Northwood by calling it Eastwick.
I noticed that.
I don't know why I did that. Tony and I prided ourselves on being rootless. We also aspired to a future condition of rootlessness and saw no contradiction in the two states of mind, or in the fact that we each lived with our parents, who were, for that matter, the freeholders of our respective homes. Tony far outclassed me in rootlessness. His parents were Polish Jews, and though we didn't actually know it for certain, we were practically sure that they'd escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto at the very last minute. This gave Tony the flash foreign name of Barbarowski, 2 languages, 3 cultures, and a sense, he assured me, of atavistic wrench. In short, real class. Despite the handicaps of being English and non-Jewish, I tried to do my bit in a home counties sort of way. Our family was small, but there was enough tepidity of feeling to effect a wideish diaspora. The Lloyds, well, our Lloyds, my father's Lloyds at least, came from Basingstoke. My mother's family from Lincoln. Relatives skulked incommunicado in several counties, lying low at Christmas, turning up with sulky regularity at funerals, and, if pressed, at weddings. Apart from Uncle Arthur, who lived within Sunday afternoon distance, they were inaccessible, which suited me fine, as I could pretend they were all picturesque rustics, gnarled artisans, or homicidal eccentrics. All they had to do was fork out at Christmas, and fork out money, or at least something that was convertible. Like Tony, I was dark, but several inches taller. Some would have called me skinny, but I preferred to think of myself as having the whippy strength of a young sapling. I had a low-key English face which suited the low-key sense of expatriation common to all who lived in Eastwick. Everyone in this suburb of a couple of thousand people seemed to have come in from elsewhere. They would have been attracted by the solidly built houses, the reliable railway service, and the good gardening soil. I found the cosy, controlled rootlessness of the place reassuring. Où habites-tu? They would ask year after year, drilling us for French orals, and I would always smirkingly reply, J'habite Metroland. It sounded better than Eastwick, stranger than Middlesex, more like a concept in the mind than a place where you shopped. And so, of course, it was. As the Metropolitan Railway had pushed westward in the 1880s, a thin corridor of land was opened up with no geographical or ideological unity. You lived there because it was an area easy to get out of. The name Metroland, adopted during the First World War, both by estate agents and the railway itself, gave the string of rural suburbs a spurious integrity.
Lovely. The sense of migration and movement is very strong, and it just strikes me particularly as well, thinking of what Baz was talking about in terms of the research that you've done, and that there's a great deal more diversity, I suppose, everywhere these days. But even back then, of course, there were, people from Eastern Europe and people from different places. So I just wonder what your reflections are on the changes, if you like, since Metroland was written, and what you have to say about that kind of diverse.
It was pretty undiverse when I was there. I was there from the age of 10 to the age of 20. It was 100% white. Right. 120% white, I'd say.
Yeah.
It was odd. I have a brother who's 3 years older, lives in France, and I was emailing him about, as I occasionally do, saying, what do you remember about this and what do you remember about that? And of course, when you're growing up, unless you have something really horrible or extraordinary in your life, you think that this is normal. You think, this is it. And it wasn't till I was sort of thinking about it and with my brother that I realised that we had a very enclosed life. my parents. My father was a school teacher, and he went to St Clement Danes to teach every day. And my mother was at home, and then she became a teacher later, went back to teaching later. We didn't really have any friends. We didn't have any. I'm not whining. Because we didn't know that we ought to have friends.
Right.
We didn't take part. We didn't go to church. We didn't play golf. We didn't do a tennis club.
So you weren't really part of the whole suburban way of life?
No, I mean that was one of the things that you could live apart from it, within it.
Right.
But of course, that's why it was there. That it was there for commuters.
Yes.
And when I would go to school, and then on Saturday morning I would go down to South London to Grove Park to play sport. There were men. The rolling stock was quite different from it is now. It was it was brown and high and square topped, and had enormously deep seats, single carriages, enormously deep seats, so that you thought that the Victorian femur was longer than it is now, which somehow shrunk as a race, and there were string luggage racks, knotted string luggage racks, and mainly it would be almost entirely men going there and back, as I did, and they still wore bowler hats, and they still went into the city on a Saturday morning.
Yeah.
That was quite normal. We didn't go to church. I said that maybe, but church. In fact, that very English way, church sort of slightly ruled in that you didn't do anything on a Sunday morning when people went to church which could be deemed in any way offensive to religion. So you didn't wash your car until the afternoon. You didn't play loud music, and especially you didn't start the motor mower. No one mowed their lawn on a Sunday morning.
Right.
And then in the afternoon, everyone got out and washed their cars, mowed the lawn, and made loud noises.
Yes. Baz?
Yeah, just wondering, because Metroland is such a knowing book. It's really about sort of the growth of consciousness. And when was the moment of realization when you could identify exactly the process you were just describing? Sort of, it's basically white. There's all these kind of particular habits of behavior, and the book is kind of reflecting on that, I guess. So, could you say something about that process and how that led to Metroland during your teens? One would assume.
I think when you're that age, you're both very self-conscious, and yet strangely unaware. And so I wasn't aware that I was sort of processing what Metroland was and what it represented and what my opinions of it now or later might be. I just lived there.
It's ironic in a sense, isn't it, that it was created back in the 1920s, 1930s as a place to escape to, from London, if you like.
Yes.
And yet, in some ways, it's also a place or a state of mind to escape from. So,
yes,
depending on your I don't know, your politics or your sense of self.
It was very safe.
Yes.
You don't realise that at the time, but it was, compared to other places, extremely safe. And one of my favourite memories of it is that I lived in a road called Murray Road, and at the end, which led to the sort of the station and the shops, there was a police station, and there was a lot of fake half timbering,
right,
as there is all over,
including the cars.
Or roading, including the cars, yes, and they had, on the front garden of the police station, they had a little birdhouse on a long pole, and then it was like a house with a hole in the middle, and it was half timbered.
Oh, fabulous.
It was black and white. I mean, if only, I bet it's disappeared, if only someone had slapped a preservation.
Rather like that poster behind you, perhaps.
What, this one?
Yes, the house there. That's sort of.
That's a bit. Yes,
that's a bit more mock Tudor, isn't it?
The birdhouse was even more black and white.
Oh, was it?
Tudor Beethan, yes, than that.
Well, there's something very, I don't know, almost bourgeois, perhaps, about that birdhouse, and that leads me on to the next question, which is really
it was bourgeois, but it was surreal.
Surreal bourgeois.
That's the thing about it.
Even better. But the title Metroland, I mean, it refers obviously to a place. We've been talking about that.
Yes.
And I think we've also been talking about the fact that it refers to a sort of sense of identity. And I think it's interesting that you've also got the contrast with Paris, where of course you've got the metro, so it's a different type of metro land.
Very good. I didn't think of that at the
time.
time.
I thought you had.
No.
So there is a sort of an echo there. But my question really now is that it's about this concept of a bourgeois life, and I think you've got another reading for us. Actually, we've got the section where on the train. Chris finds himself as a schoolboy sitting opposite the old chap who's just recently retired. And I think he says, one afternoon, rolling home as usual on the 1413 from Baker Street, I was checking off stations like rosary beads when a voice on my right said, Verney Junction. He was an old sod, I thought, dead bourgeois. So not just bourgeois, dead bourgeois. Yes. Almost dead to the young Chris, perhaps.
Yes.
But a portent of things to come as well, because in some ways this is perhaps Chris looking at his future self. Is that something that was in your mind at that point?
Yes. His future self turns out to be someone about as old as me. But that's quite interesting. Yes, as you said, he meets this old guy on a train who tells him an inordinate amount, pages and pages about Metroland, and he thinks at first the chap's trying to seduce him. You know, all those fears you have as an unaccompanied 13-year-old or whatever on the underground. And the other thing is that this is the first time the F word occurs in the novel, but it's euphemized. I never used the F word as a boy until I was about 16. I don't think I knew it till I was about 14. And Chris and Tony are supposedly they talk about fug, F-U-G-G, and fugger, and that's because they had read Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead, which was meant to be a very hot, violent book of the time, early 1950s, I think it came out. And he uses that, obviously, because American publishers wouldn't allow the CK.
Yes.
So he's looking at this chap opposite him. He was an elegiac old fugger, that was for sure. He told me about workmen's fairs and electrification and Lord's Station, which was closed when war broke out. About someone called Sir Edward Watkin, who had some plans or other. Some ambitious old turd, no doubt, who couldn't tell Tissot from Titian. It wasn't just ambition, you see. There was confidence as well, confidence in ambition. Nowadays, he spotted the reflex glaze over, which my face always gave when I heard that last word, nowadays. Don't sneer at the Victorians, my lad, he said sharply. Suddenly, he sounded as if he was turning nasty again. Maybe he was a rapist. Maybe he realised how I'd outwitted him, i.e. by playing along with him. Look at the things they did instead. What, me? Sneer at the Victorians? I didn't have enough sneer room left. By the time I'd finished sneering at dummos, prefects, masters, parents, my brother and sister, 3rd Division North football, Molière, God, the bourgeoisie and normal people, I didn't have any strength left for more than a twisted pout at history. I looked at the old fugger and had a go at an expression of moral outrage, but it wasn't one my face was much good at. You see, it wasn't just the people who built the railway and ran it, it was everyone else as well. You probably aren't interested. Christ, he did go on, didn't he? But when the first through train from Baker Street to Farringdon Street arrived, the passengers cleaned out the restaurant buffet at Farringdon Street in 10 minutes flat. 10 minutes flat, like a plague of locusts. He was almost talking to himself now, but I thought it wise to slot in another question just to be on the safe side. Is that why they called it Metroland? I asked. Not really sure what I was talking about, but taking care not to sneer. Metroland? That nonsense. He turned his attention to me again. That was the beginning of the end. No, that was much later, sometime during the war before Hitler's. That was all to please the estate agents, make it sound cosy, cosy homes for cosy heroes. 25 minutes from Baker Street and a pension at the end of the line, he said unexpectedly. Made it what it is now, bourgeois dormitory. It was as if someone had dropped a bag of cutlery inside my head. Hey, Christ, you can't say that. It's not allowed. Look at yourself. I can call you bourgeois. Well, I think I can anyway. You can't call yourself it. It's just not on. I mean, it's against all the known rules. It's like a schoolmaster admitting that he knows his own nickname. Well, I suppose it can only be answered by a non-conventional response. Aren't you a bourgeois then? I inventoried to myself his clothes, voice, briefcase. Of course I am, he said lightly, almost gently. His tone reassured me, but his words remain a puzzle. And that does, as you say, look forward to the third part, where Tony returns to live in Metroland.
Yes. So, being bourgeois, I mean, it's an interesting question, and Baz, I'm interested because you have a perspective not just from your research, but also you're Dutch. You've lived in the UK for a while. Do we all seem pretty bourgeois to the Dutch? I mean, how does that work?
Not at all, no. Not at all. I mean,
The Dutch are pretty bourgeois.
The Dutch, of course they are. The burgers, of course, the burgers of
not me, but
No, not me.
No, not me either.
The others. Yeah.
Everybody else.
But I'm interested to maybe think about, because we're revisiting Metroland and what was the bourgeoisie in 1980, 1977, etc., and the means of resistance after the 1960s and the idealism that was part of that decade, which kind of squashed in a way in the novel, with Tony becoming like a kind of a pathetic figure, not really mature. How do you think about how has the middle classes or the idea of the bourgeoisie developed itself over the past 42 years? How are people still épaté le bourgeoisie today?
I mean, the word bourgeois is used a lot because that's the word the boys used. And,
yes.
And it's they use a lot of French words and a lot of French slang.
Yes.
And there's this phrase épater le bourgeois, to shock the bourgeois.
Yes.
And they try to do it. And I put into it. I did have a friend called Tony. Okay. He wasn't called Barbarossa. And he did once go into, at the time, you know, this would be mid '60s, and when sort of Carnaby Street and so on were going. And I can't remember whether I put this incident into the novel or not.
Baz will tell us.
But Baz will tell us. And he was gay, and he was down Oxford Street or Carnaby Street, and there was a clothes shop which said "man shop" on it. And he went into it and he said, "I like a man and two small boys, please."
It is in there, or at least, yes, I've read that. It's in there, isn't it?
He was much more patting the bourgeoisie than I was.
Fabulous.
But of course, you know, you don't. The thing is that by then the bourgeoisie had been around so long and mocked so much that you couldn't get a rise out.
No, they didn't bat an eyelid.
No.
Suits you, sir.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
There are other big themes in the novel, of course. I mean, the if you like, the art versus life. There's a sense that in the early days, Chris and Tony spend their time in the National Gallery,
yes,
observing the bourgeoisie and seeing if they can. I'm not sure.
They weren't examining. It wasn't so much the bourgeoisie that they were looking at. They had, you know, they're high-minded as well as cynical.
Yes.
These two, and they're passionate about art and literature, music, and so on. But the sort of basic question they ask themselves at one point, and which indeed, if you start off and you write a novel. One of the questions is in your mind is, why am I writing it and what effect do I think it will have? And this I transfer into the very first scene in the novel, in which the two boys go into the National Gallery, and they look through binoculars at people looking at paintings.
Yes.
And trying to see, trying to read their responses. Yeah. And the other one would have binoculars, the other would have a little notebook, and they'd say things like, skin tension, eye narrowing. And then there's one where a woman's been sitting there for a very long time, and they say, yes, really absorbed in this picture, eyes closed, maybe asleep.
So they're trying to measure the effect of art in a sense.
Yes, exactly.
And it's that idea that art somehow, is a good thing, or at least has an impact.
I think it's the most important thing.
Yes, the most important thing for the young boys. And then there's a sense that becomes less of an issue or less of an important thing, perhaps inevitably, as they move into the life side of things and reality takes hold. So it struck me that there's a sort of a movement from idealism as represented in art and beauty,
yes,
into something perhaps a little bit more mundane.
Not for both boys.
No.
Tony retains his idealism,
yes,
or folly, as Chris might think. Chris settles for life back in Metroland.
Yes. And is quite happy with it.
Yes, indeed. And he says at one point, yes, I'm back in Metroland, but, it's ironic, but growing up is about learning to ride irony and take it in your stride.
Yes, yes.
And that things you believed before, you were right to believe them, but that's not what life's about,
no.
You see. So his...
it's interesting because he changes, doesn't he? Chris changes.
Yes.
Tony, and I think there's a line in the book, effectively stays the same, almost as a child. And I suppose, again, it depends on your perspective, whether Chris is selling out or Tony's just,
not growing up.
Not growing up, yes.
Yes. Those questions are indeed there and are left open to the reader's discretion to answer, based on the reader's own life.
Yes. Well, talking about life, there's also a big theme throughout the novel, I think, of death and sex. And in fact, one of the chapters is I think called The Big D.
The Big D. Yes.
Which of course juxtaposes with La Petite Mort. Yes. Which is literally the little death, but
French for orgasm.
Exactly. I'm glad you said that. Otherwise, I would have had to. But there's a discussion in that section, which I think you're now going to read for us, which is about immortality and art. Yes. But it also touches, interestingly, on climate change and the destruction of the planet, which struck me as particularly prescient for 1963. So I'd like to hear that section, if we could.
Sometimes prescience is also known as luck. Chris has just explained his attitude to death, which was exactly my attitude and continues to be, which is, I wouldn't mind dying at all, I thought, as long as I didn't finish up dead at the end of it. While Tony and I never discussed basic fears, concepts of immortality naturally came under discussion. Like self-respecting maze rats, we looked for ways out. There was partial survival to be considered, a gruely bit of essence nimbusing around in a Huxleyan goo, but we didn't go much on that. There was also immortality through one's children, but looking at how we represented our own parents, we couldn't be sanguine about our own chances of surrogate survival when it came to our turn. Mostly in our sneaky, whining dreams of immortality, we concentrated on art. And then he quotes a poem by a French early 19th century poet Théophile Gautier, who wrote a famous book called Émo et Camé, Enamels and Cameos. And the two lines go, tout passe, l'art robuste seul à l'éternité. Everything passes, only the robustness of art lasts eternally. And then he goes on, belief in art was initially an effective remedy against the routine ache of Big D. But then someone communicated to me the concept of planet death. You might be able to get used to the idea of personal extinction if you thought the world went on forever, with generations of kids sitting back in amazement as your works and life chattered through on computer printout. But when someone in the Science Sixth pointed out to me over lunch that the Earth was floating inexorably towards a last burn-up, it gave a new look to the robustness of art. LPs syruping, sets of Dickens flaring up at Fahrenheit 451, Donatello's melting like Dali watches. Get out of that one.
How do we get out of that one? I mean, as we sit here in Amersham, COP27, of course, is taking place in Egypt. I think the UN Secretary General warned just a couple of weeks ago that the window to take urgent climate action change is closing rapidly. I think that it's an interesting topic given what's going on in the world, but I just want to invite your thoughts on that, really.
Well, those boys didn't have any thoughts
No.
on climate change. They only had thoughts about personal immortality, and then the sudden notion of personal mortality,
Yeah.
or immortality, and then the sudden realization that planet Earth is definitely mortal and is going to burn up, or I think gets cold before it burns up, or maybe it burns up and then goes cold. Anyway, we're doomed.
Yes.
I'm not optimistic. There are lots of wonderful people working to alert the world, but the world is not being alerted. The world doesn't. It asks for a lack of selfishness, and high endeavour, and a working together, which I sort of don't think we can do in the time. If you look at, it's the America, Russia, China, India to a lesser extent, polluting the world and then lying about their figures. And if it really is down to a few years, we're stuffed. And you already see enormous floods in Pakistan. Almost every month there is a you call it a near-end event.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we do things like recycle and give to charities, but if you believe that there will in time be the political will there to get it done, I admire your idealism.
Well, it's interesting. Personally, I share your pessimism, but equally, I do have some optimism. When you think about the political situation, you're right, of course, but there is also the other sort of political with a small p, and it just I'm looking now as I sit here at the Chilterns Landscape Partnership logo, and they are involved in quite a few different local activities, which I think provide some cheer in what is undoubtedly a global gloomy picture. But there are, for example, projects restoring grassland meadows, carbon dumps, and working with the Rothschild Foundation on storing carbon in farm soils.
Have I gone off air? It's because I said foggy. It automatically cuts you out in Metroland if you say okay?
Do we have to go back?
I'll say it again. Yes. Well, I do not diminish those things.
No, but they are. But there have to be a lot of that kind of activity, I think. Baz, what's your take on this?
I'm just wondering what the role of art is. Does it make sense to make art? And just wondering how, because you're kind of intimating there is some thinking about the worth and about the earth, and how can a novelist kind of help forge a planetary imagination, or at least translate to get that awareness going? Is that, I don't know, the role of an artist? Just wondering how you feel about that. And a second kind of question, which has been on my mind recently, is about the Extinction Rebellion people throwing beans at Van Gogh paintings in the Louvre, and what do you make about that? What do you think of that, actually?
Well, I can understand that rage, and I noticed that they threw the tomato soup and the baked beans at pictures which were fully glazed.
That's
which
very
was
bourgeois.
sensitive and quite proper, and indeed, you know, would more likely get people on their side than if they threw them at an unglazed Van Gogh.
Yes.
You know, what is the role of an artist, briefly, is to tell the truth as he or she sees it, and as much truth as he or she can see. But then it also depends on the sort of nature of your talent, which you're not answerable to. That's what you have, and what you're, and that imposes the kind of artist that you are. And I'm not a sort of warning artist. I'm a descriptive artist. I mean, that doesn't mean I can't describe or won't shortly not be able to avoid describing some terrible world event. Mainly, increasingly and mainly, I write about love and death, I think. But then death gets you to planet death, and love gets you to the notion that you're, I don't have children, but that the people with children will have to imagine their subsequent generations being reduced to a terrible state.
Well, that actually leads nicely into one of the questions that we've got coming through now from the audience at home, and I think this probably ties in quite well, Julian, with the reading that you were going to give next, the final reading. So this is. This is a question really about the railways and you know, what they do to the countryside, and whether or not that's progress. I mean, we're talking about Metroland, but of course there's HS2. We've got the Elizabeth line, and on the one hand, you know, these sort of technological developments bring a great deal, but they also take away some things, and I think. The question we've got here relates to that, but perhaps you'd like to read the passage first.
And I'd just like to say that writers were on it from the beginning, that both Ruskin here and Flaubert in France warned in the very early days of the railways that they were a great technological and scientific advance which contained within them absolutely no moral advance. And that's one of the distinctions that should be made about new developments like that. I can't remember which of the two. I think both of them said something like, "Oh, the only thing that railways do is that a man can get from, let's call it Northwood to Harrow on the Hill 8 times more quickly and be just as stupid when he gets there as he was when he left."
Yes.
So writers were warning about that sort of thing. This is from a chapter which has the rather puzzling title of "Nude Giant Girls," and this is "Nude Giant Girls" is actually a quotation from the poet Stephen Spender, and he compares electricity pylons to nude giant girls. You know, they have that sort of skirt-like bottom and then the sort of arms and the dangling hands. I was very struck by it when I first saw it. I think less of it now because it's not so much they're nude, so much they're skeletal.
Yes.
And Chris, the narrator, when they go for a drive in a car, would sort of nudge his brother and say, "Nude giant girls." And his brother would look out, hoping to see something of that nature, but failing.
Slightly disappointed.
Okay, so this is the very beginning of the third part, when Chris has returned to Metroland. When do the theories stop, and why? Say what you will, they stop for most of us. Are they killed by a single decisive event? For some, perhaps. But usually they die by attrition, lingeringly, circumstantially. And afterwards you wonder, how seriously did we mean them anyway? On Sunday mornings I slip out of the house early. I turn left past sensible detached houses, Ravenshoe with its scatter of horse chestnut flowers on the pavement, Vue de Provence with its green shutters, East Coker with a smirk-provoking carport. They have their names carved in Gothic letters on the slices of wood which are screwed to trees. I pick my way across the golf course, watching an early drive catch the dew on its first bounce and pull up quickly, glistening. I like it here. I like the misty, different perspective. From high up by the fourth tee, you can follow tiny figures pulling trolleys along the fairway and bursting into striped colour at the touch of rain. From here, the self-condemning cries of "4" seem distant and comic, and I smile as I remember Tony's answering bellow of "Skin!" Below, smart silver trains process with the clack of muted knitting machines. Their windows flash the sun at you like boys with playground mirrors. Churches remind other people to get up and pray. It's certainly ironic to be back in Metroland. As a boy, what would I have called it? The syphilis of the soul, or something like that, I dare say. But isn't part of growing up being able to ride irony without being thrown? Besides, it's an efficient place to live. Next to the record shop is a grocer's which sells eggs with shit and straw on them. 2 minutes' walk from where Marion gets her hair done, you can see real pigs mucking up a field. 5 minutes' drive, and you're in open country, where only the pylons remind you of town life. As a boy, when we drove past those pylons, I would elbow Nigel out of his SF magazine with a whisper of, "Look, nude giant girls." Nowadays, when we pass them, I think of the poem, but I find it excited and inexact.
Well, that does tie in very well with the question that we had there from Anna, which was with the railways representing progress, but also destroying countryside, and really asking whether technology is a good thing. Baz, is technology a good thing? I'm throwing that one to you.
Interesting.
You've just come back from Japan.
Bit of
so.
a very open question. The question maybe
I suppose with regards to the countryside.
Yeah, no, I understand. We need to sacrifice maybe some of our own private pleasures. I think it's one of the phrases you used, Julian, at the end of the novel, to open up the world
right.
A bit more. And so it is about being a bit selfless and giving up. And that is when technology can create some progress, I think. I work in Wolverhampton. I travel around Birmingham quite a lot, and opening up London and the country a bit more, I think, is very useful. There is a process of democracy, I think. And if it's trains, I think that's much better than everyone flying around. So I think it's probably a good step forward. We'll see. What do you think?
I don't. Well, yeah. I think things like HS2 are absurd. It's going to cut, what is it, half an hour or something off a journey to Manchester at a time when, particularly during and since the pandemic, everyone's been working virtually anyway. Yeah. So the actual need for extra people to go there faster seems a sort of 19th century concept rather than the 21st century concept.
I wonder if I should speak up for my northern my northern family here and say, well, yes, but you would say that if you're down in the south.
Yeah.
Well, they should improve the railways that are there.
Absolutely right.
And apart from investing much more in your family and your friends.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, I'm all for that. The ludicrously named Levelling Up project of the ludicrous Boris Johnson. Yeah. It was never going to happen anyway because nothing he said was ever true. But it's now being used, and equally mendaciously of what is going to happen.
Yeah.
No. No, I won't make any more political points.
Oh, no, don't tease us, Julian. Come on. You're amongst friends here. Nobody's really listening. No, plenty of people are listening online, thankfully. And thank you for your questions. There's still time if you want to submit a question to us online here. We do have another one here. Cecil from Chesham. Did you enjoy your drive through Chesham Bois? Am I pronouncing that right? Do you still have the same perceptions of Metroland as when you wrote the book?
Well, when I wrote the book, it was very much about, as I said, about Northwood
Yes.
Hills, that sort of area. And I don't know, I might have been to Aylesbury. I'd been to Aylesbury. I'd probably gone through Amersham and Chesham once or twice, but I didn't. I was obviously thinking about what I knew about when I wrote the book, and so driving through. Do you call it Bois or Bois?
It's Bois.
Bois, yeah.
Oh, that was a resounding. Yeah. They've been so quiet so far.
Let's not have any of this French nonsense. Bois in Metroland, Chesham.
I should rephrase that. Then. Chesham
like
Boys.
Football team, doesn't it?
Chesham Boys.
Yeah.
Well, there is the Wickham. What is it? Yes.
So
Chair Boys. Yes, the Wickham Chair Boys. Thank you.
No, I thought it looked lovely. The trees were on the turn. It's a perfect autumn, even if it should have finished by now. But that's global warming for you.
Well,
and it looked beautiful and cared for, and the houses were nicer than they were in Northwood, and I thought it was very calming.
we are getting a few more questions. So yes. A member of the audience reminded me that the football team is called the Wickham Chair Boys. Am I right? Yes. And if I'm not mistaken, there is going to be a project or something to do with the football team, to do with part of the work of the chalk, cherries and chairs. I think the chairs is the connection. So do watch out for that online. There'll be more about that in the future. And I should say at this stage, please do follow the Chalk, Cherries and Chairs website or Twitter, Eventbrite, Instagram. You can keep up to date with everything that's happening, and there are going to be more events like this one, hopefully, with different people in the future. However, back to the questions. We've got a question here from Nazim from Slough. Oh, do you think the new Elizabethan... I keep saying Elizabethan. It's not Elizabethan, is it? It's Elizabeth. Do you think the new Elizabeth line will transform the future area in the same way that the Metropolitan line did in the past? You don't like HS2. How do you feel about Elizabeth line? Pass. Okay, you can ask a friend.
I haven't taken the Elizabeth line yet.
Me neither. Have you, Baz?
Just a tiny bit. So
right.
It will definitely transform it for sure. I mean,
but it's
clearly.
But it's not as if the area of Slough is sort of not is underdeveloped, is it? Or
no,
not built on very much.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose it will mean that some commuters can now commute faster from further out.
Yeah. I suppose that's what happened here.
Yes.
You know.
Yes.
So
yes.
In many ways, there may well be a repeat of that. This is perhaps an easier one for you to answer. I'm not sure. You'll have to tell me. What's your writing process, Julian? We don't have a name for that one. There's an anonymous. Could be a friend or foe, or a competitor.
Yes. Well, this is one question I always lie about.
Oh, is it? Oh, well, please feel free to lie.
I get up at 6. I do an hour's calisthenics. Translate a little Tolstoy from the original Russian, and then I get down to work and I sweat blood. Well, my writing process is, the writing process often starts or continues in the middle of the night, which is very nice. That because when you're really writing something and you're intently present in it and with it, you find you wake up in the middle of the night and you start thinking about it, or it's almost as if your brain is chugging away and it's just saying, by the way, I'd like to point this out to you. And sometimes, if it seems really important, you get up and turn the light on, write it down. And sometimes, to your dismay, you realise you've written down something that's in the book already. but
memory again.
Surprisingly often, it is something that is not just not in the book already, but is also cogent. And you think, gosh, and it's a nice feeling that when you go to sleep, another part of you is still on it.
That's how you've managed to write so many books. You're working 24 hours a day.
And then I suppose I used to start at 10, and one of the parts of learning the writing process is knowing what is right for you, and knowing when your energy is most available, and then being surprised sometimes with books that it's different. It used to be I could write original stuff from about 10 to 1. And then, again, maybe from 5 to 7 in the evening. Those are the times when my brain was working best. But I remember writing one book, Arthur and George, which is my longest novel, about Conan Doyle and a Parsi boy who was wrongly convicted of animal mutilation. And I'd write it all through the morning. I'd have lunch. I'd go straight back and carry on writing. I couldn't understand it. And I kept thinking it would go away. But that lasted for the whole of that book.
Gosh.
It's never come back again. So part of your writing process is acknowledging that it can still change.
Right. And Baz, you've written 10 books yourself, so do you have the same process?
It's completely different. It's more critical, theoretical, analytical. So not necessarily creative.
Right.
So I think it's a different process.
Yeah.
But I do have a specific routine, getting up pretty early, not 6. And first doing some reading. I think it really it clears the mind and it gives you a particular focus. And doing that for an hour, making notes, and then going into the actual writing process itself. So I think that's kind of my modus operandi for a while, but it does change. And energy levels are different throughout different periods of your life, and I think that's really, you don't really understand what your body does, what your brain does, etc.
Right.
So it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Kind of.
I've found in recent decades that the Guardian cryptic crossword is a way of waking my brain up, and I do as much of it as I can. With and after breakfast, until I realise it's going to spoil my day rather than start my working life. But that's something.
So are you writing a new book at the moment? Or is that...
Harry Kane, when asked a question, he often replies, I don't know if you notice this, he replies, yes, no, but. Which I never thought would come in useful...
It's also a
in my own Q&As. So there you go. Yes, no, but.
Okay, we'll take that as a... okay, I think just a couple of more questions. We've got one here from Imogen Bright, who's interested to hear about your interest in France, or as I would say, France. How did it start, Julian? How did you first get interested in La France?
A mixture of school and home. My parents were both French teachers. And the first foreign holiday I ever went on would have been in 1958, probably. We went to France. We drove around. There were very, very few British cars on the roads at that time, and if you saw one coming towards you, you'd wave.
Yes.
My mother, who was very good on etiquette, said you must wave but never hoot.
Oh, really?
Yes, that was vulgar.
Hooting was vulgar.
And so it was very exotic. This was only 13 years after the war ended, and then we did that for sort of 3 or 4 years thereafter, and so it was my primary exotic was France, and I read it. I did French. I did languages for A levels and then at university. and it's always been my alternative reality.
Interesting. So let's just have one final question, I think, from online. And this one comes from Lorette Reed. Julian, what stimulates you to start a new book? Do you think that you will come to a time when you no longer want to write?
I think there will come a time when I'm no longer able to. My wife was a literary agent every so often. She would think about retiring, and she'd say two things. One is, I might do it if there was a different name for it. And the other was, I won't stop until someone pushes me up against the wall and says, you can't do this anymore. Something my publisher might push me up against the wall and say, you can't do this anymore.
I doubt it somehow.
Well, you never know. And what was the first part of the question?
What stimulates you to start a new book?
You don't know. It's usually very different from book to book. And sometimes it's something specific that you can identify. And sometimes, mostly, I'd say, it's something quite in the past, 10 years back, sometimes more, and you didn't know at the time that it was a book. I've never watched something happen and thought, oh, there's a short story there, something like that. And the one thing that never ever works is when someone comes up and says, oh, you're a writer, I've got a story for you.
Here's one you should do.
And I say, no, you've got a story for yourself.
Yeah, yes. And do you remember what was there a stimulus for Metroland?
I can't remember, except you start writing fiction, and you start off by writing what you know about.
Yes.
And also, I think I was I was interested in that notion of the adolescent adventurousness in one of the boys petering out and becoming his return to the place he came from.
Yeah.
I'm a great fan of John Updike, and I think that his Rabbit Quartet is the great post-war American novel. And the first one is called Rabbit Run, and it features Harry Rabbit Angstrom, who runs away from home from his wife, and I think she's pregnant, and just gets in the car. It lives in Pennsylvania, starts driving south, and then loses heart, turns around and goes back. And he said that when he started writing it, 3 years previously, Jack Kerouac's On the Road had come out with the great sort of, romanticism, if you like it, or pseudo-romanticism if you don't, about just getting out and blasting off and going there. And Updike said he deliberately didn't read On the Road, but he started off writing a corrective because he thought in real life what happens is you run away and then you come back. And I wasn't aware of any of that when I was writing Metroland, but I think it's a sort of parallel. It's a parallel version. Chris goes to Paris.
Yes.
He has adventures, though not the same ones as I had. And then he comes back and lives happily. I mean, that's the other thing. I deliberately didn't make him discontented and nostalgic about his own earlier life and hopes and ambitions. I sort of respect him.
Yes.
I respect what he's become.
Yeah. Which is interesting, and it does obviously bring the novel in a sense full circle, which again is a nice segue, because I think we've come almost full circle today. I would like to, as we do have a little bit of time, offer the opportunity to the audience here in the room to ask any questions. You're not mic'd, so I will repeat your question if you do have one for Julian. Now is your chance to ask. Yes.
A comment and a question. Comment is, I enjoyed the book immensely, and the nice thing was that it was affirming. It's very easy for people to be cynical about Metroland, and actually the book picks up the positives, and the discussions picked up the positives, and the posters you to look at, the countryside and the railway side by side is the point of it. It's the best of both. Unlike HS2, which is just going through and not stopping at the point. No, I thought it was great. I also was thinking, with Remembrance Sunday today, I grew up in Chesham Boys, And Amersham on the hill
Boys.
is the Metroland, not Old Amersham. That's the distinction. It's very subtle. But I was thinking in the 50s, and probably in the 20s, when the first ones were built, post-war era, you had a lot of people, father's friends were here, who had fought through, and they wanted to be able to have their quiet Sunday mornings. They wanted to be able to walk on the golf course, and who can blame them? You know, it was very much of its time.
Yes.
But my question's much more simple. Reading it.
I'm glad, because I don't think I could repeat all of that.
Sorry.
I will repeat the question for the benefit of our viewers at home.
Simply this: in following Chris's life through, did you ever think about letting us see what he did and how he experienced life at university?
Okay, so let me repeat that question for our viewers at home. It's really a question of whether, Julian, you thought of allowing us to see the part of Chris's life at university and how he experienced that.
No, I never thought of that, because when I was starting off, I was thinking that there were certain areas which the novel had over-excavated. And when I came to write Farthest Parrot, at one point I have a list of rules about future fiction. And one is there shall be no more novels set in Oxford or Cambridge for the next 25 years, you know, because it has been sort of overdug. So no, I didn't. And the other thing I thought of looking at British and foreign fiction was that there was an awful lot of weather in it.
Weather?
Weather,
Ah.
yes. And the working title for Metroland was No Weather, because it has no weather in it.
Interesting.
I don't like, I mean, weather's fine, but it's significant weather. That's what I don't like, you know. Oh,
the
God.
storm clouds.
Oh, here come the storm clouds. Yeah, we know something bad's going to happen. That sort of stuff. I just can't take it.
Well, the sun has been shining on us today, Julian.
Yes.
But I do want to see if there's any other questions here in the room.
I don't have a question. I just want to say with regard to HS2
Yes.
that I was booking some travel from London to Manchester the other day. That's going to take me 2.5 hours. I was then trying to book a train from Manchester to Newcastle, 2.5 hours with one change.
Yeah.
So talking about the infrastructure up there being improved
Yes.
is a sorry, that's not a question for you, Julian.
Well,
No,
I'll take it on. It's friendly.
So that
Yeah, they should buck up.
Yeah,
The government should buck up with
Local.
yeah, with local.
the comment from the audience there, for those of you at home, was really, well, as Julian has summarised, that they should buck up in terms of getting the local travel organised. I think that's what we're saying. Well, I have to say that is nearly it, I'm afraid, and I think we can probably agree that this has been a very constructive loaf down memory lane. I hope you've enjoyed the trip. I certainly have. And I do want to thank my fellow travellers. I want to thank Baz for his insights and for his expertise. And of course, Julian, I really want to thank you for being here. It's a relatively small gig, and your presence is muchly appreciated.
Nice to be back.
Good. Well, that's good to hear. I'd also like to thank people at home who've been logging on and watching and sending through some questions. I think we got through all of them, if not certainly most of them. And please show your appreciation for Baz Groes and Julian Barnes. And just a final word from me. I hope this discussion has helped you put Metroland and this area, the Chilterns, in greater context. If you've enjoyed the event, you'll be able to revisit it on the platform you're currently on. I think it's going to stay there for a month. And after that, you'll be able to see an edited version on the Chilterns website. As I say, do follow the various social media that you can for the Chalk, Cherries and Chairs team as part of the Chilterns work, the board. 2 weeks today, I should say that there's going to be the launch of the Ballad of Bodger's Wood by the acclaimed children's poet Rachel Rooney, and that's going to be from the Roald Dahl Museum in bless you, in Great Missenden. It is the first of the original story publications from the collection. That event is sold out, But as I say, if you want to follow any more events in the future, then the way to do it is to follow Chalk, Cherries and Chairs on Eventbrite, Twitter, Facebook or Instagram. For now, we are all going to enjoy some fantastic local produce from the Chilterns. I think it's cheese and wine. And interestingly, I think the wine from this area, we can't call it champagne, but it's because of the chalk hills, it's not dissimilar.
I was told that it was better.
Well, I think...
This was by two patriots at,
really?
at lunch, yes.
Well, I think we're going to...
Better than Chablis and better than champagne.
Oh, well, we are shortly going to find out. I'm sorry if you're watching at home and you're not going to be able to partake of that, but if you do get a chance, look it up. I'm sure you'll enjoy it when you get it. That's it for now. I've been your host, Sean Keegan, and we have reached our final destination. All change, please.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.